Stop the Press, a podcast that champions the East of England from Harwich to Huntingdon via Heatherset and Halesworth, has been downloaded over 5,000 times in under 18 months. And, breaking news, you're listening to it. Welcome to Eastern Promise. I'm Mike Rigby, and thank you for joining me for episode 59 of Eastern Promise, the podcast that's on a mission to share the manifold wonders of the East of England across the globe. This week, we've assembled an expert panel to consider both the current state of local journalism in the East of England and its future. Former ITV Anglia head of news Mike Talbot, former editor of the Eastern Daily Press David Powles, and broadcast journalism course director at the UEA Clare Precey join me to discuss the future of local media. And we'll meet some of the next generation of local journalists. And finally, no crowdsourcery this week, as I'm on my hollybobs. In its place is an evergreen classic from the archives. For 1 week only, it's TV time for Challenge Anglia. In January, MPs on the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee published their report into the sustainability of local journalism. If you were to read that report, as I did in preparation for the panel that you're about to hear, you'd be forgiven for thinking that local journalism was in serious jeopardy. Not so. When I arrived at Broadcast House, the University of East Anglia's broadcast training facility, housed in the former studios of Radio Broadland in the heart of Norwich, something remarkable happened. As I looked at the wall of achievement, which tells current students of the successes of their forebears, and talking to students at Broadcast House, I realised that the Select Committee's prognostications might be wide of the mark, and that the future wasn't quite as bleak as had been painted. Well, we're here in Broadcast House, belonging to the UEA, and we're here with some MA students. On what course are you guys on?
Masters in Broadcast and Digital Journalism.
Same? They're all nodding, it's the same. And we're talking to Emily
Goodwin.
Emily Goodwin. So what is it like? How far are you into the course?
We started in September and now it's February, so I suppose 6 months in.
6 months. How's it going?
I think it's going really well. I think it was very intimidating to begin with because we've come from a university setting into a newsroom setting, and that was quite a big jump for lots of people. But now it just feels normal, it feels second nature, and it's a really collaborative learning environment as well, which is lovely.
Fantastic. And I'm going to ask the second Emily, whose name is Emily
Erith.
Emily Erith. Do you switch around your teams a lot? Are you used to working in, and do you sort of come in and when you're working on a new project, is there a new assignment of news buddies, if I can be glib?
We do get to have a lot of choice with like who we work with, we collaborate, and it's nice to have like the breakout areas to like really bounce ideas off each other, and I think that develops the story into lots of angles that you probably wouldn't have thought of on your own. So it's a great way to like experiment with new stories and things like that and really push yourself. But then we also get assigned different teams to work in projects for summatives or formatives, and then you spend time with people that you might not necessarily socialise with outside of class. So it's a good way of pushing yourself and experiencing a practical work environment but in a student setting.
So today you've already had a special guest, Julian Sturdy, come in to speak to you, and Zoe, isn't it?
Yeah, my name's Zoe.
Zoe.
Julian's our lecturer.
He's a lecturer, so no, he's not special. Not that special.
He's very special. Julian brought in a special guest for us today, Mary Manderfield, and she was so inspiring. I think we all left the session with her feeling like oh my goodness, we love her. We love how she got into her career. And there's so many different ways to go into journalism. And I think that was what's so inspiring about her. She didn't have a typical career path, going straight into one of the big TV or news stations. She had a really interesting career, and it was fantastic to hear about that. And she was so inspiring.
Well, when I was at university, there were I house shared with a load of broadcast journalism students who had basically three choices: print, TV, radio. But now, oh my God, you've got the big traditional outlets. You've got local news outlets, but you've also got the web and all these new TV stations, YouTube, like Byline Times. What does that do in terms of choice? You feel like the world's your oyster at this point, Eleanor?
Yeah, so we do a little bit of everything. We've been doing social media posts, making digital videos for posting specifically on YouTube or TikTok or other social media. But we do the traditional things as well. We've been learning radio production, TV production, and writing. And I think it is really important, especially now, to be able to do a little bit of everything, because you never know what you're going to be asked to do and you never know what path you're going to be going into. So I think it's really important that here we learn just a little bit of everything, so we're really prepared for whatever life throws at us. And
so what do you think about this facility? It's really, really, really well stocked.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. We've got a television studio, we've got 2 radio studios, and one of them is a podcasting studio, which I believe you're podcasting in today.
We're that today.
But we also have our newsroom with all the computers. And all our breakout spaces and all our equipment. It's absolutely brilliant. We have access to so many different things.
So to draw this to a close, because I can see various people appearing at the end who I'm supposed to be talking to. So quickly draw us to a close. I just want to know, out of interest, where your sort of dream not endpoint, but where you want to go post MA, where your media career, where you'd like to see that take you. Emily?
I'd like to be a travel journalist, and if not like world news, something a bit wider than our very small. I grew up in Suffolk and I lived in Suffolk.
No shame in that.
No shame in it, but I think I'd like to really broaden my horizons and experience the world. Yeah.
Emily?
I'm still quite open to trying different things, but I think my interests are either in like sports journalism or in like the theatre world as well.
Oh, wow.
Quite like not necessarily performing, but doing something that involves the press, PR for that would be interesting.
Sorry, I'm waving. So, hazard with this, you end up waving it around and people haven't quite finished yet. You got the Norfolk and Norwich Festival coming up, so that'd be interesting beat to Zoe.
Yeah, so before I came to the Masters, I was a meteorologist. So I worked in weather forecasting. So after this Masters in broadcast journalism, I hope to go into something that will merge the two of those things together. So I'd really like to go into climate journalism, or possibly, if I'm lucky enough, weather presenting.
Oh wow, well, that's really interesting, because I went and interviewed the head of the Tyndall Centre not so long ago, and that was a really fascinating, really positive chat. And Eleanor?
Well, I'm really interested in investigative journalism. I really like finding things out, doing a bit of my own research, but I'm very interested in documentary making, something kind of more long form, so I can do a lot of research on one project and kind of learn more about it and develop a particular story for a long time.
Thank you so much for talking to me. Best of luck in your studies. You certainly seem to be having a lot of fun, and I think that's the key, really. Thanks very much. Thank you.
It's a very good thing that I was then able to sit down in Studio 2 of Broadcast House with an extremely distinguished panel to find out more.
This is a really, really fabulous day. God, I love doing this, because here I am with, and I'm going to say it again, I said it in the test run, they chuckled, and I think that's most unfair, the most distinguished panel I've had on Eastern Promise to date, and it is... Introduce yourselves. I cannot do you justice.
Hello, shall I go first?
You go first, David Powles.
Good to be here, Mike. Yep, I'm David Powles, the ex-editor of the Eastern Daily Press and journalist for 23 years or so.
And I am Mike Talbot, a lot of ex today. I'm ex-head of news at ITV Anglia, and before that spent many years, decades in fact, working for ITV and making documentaries for the BBC and for Sky and Channel 4 and 5.
And I'm Clare Precey. I'm the Course Director, current, not ex, Course Director for Broadcast Journalism at the University of East Anglia. And I am ex-BBC and various other bits and bobs.
Excellent. See what I did there. Now,
I was going to come in. I let you all know that I was looking at the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee's report on the sustainability of local journalism. And that wasn't the most encouraging parliamentary report I've ever read. They tend not to be very uplifting and happy, but this one was particularly downbeat. But then I came in here, I met Claire for the first time, met some of the students, got them recorded, and I actually a lot more excited and buoyed about things than I otherwise would have been, having not done that. So I'm going to start with David, go to Mike and then Claire, and just ask you to describe, where are we at the moment? What's, from your point of view, the current situation of journalism in your field? Bring in whatever you think is relevant, but what's the status quo? Where are we at, David?
So clearly my background is primarily newspapers and online and regional media, having worked in regional media for the whole of my career, but obviously knowledge on other spheres as well. And I was thinking about this driving in. I was thinking about what would be a word to describe the current situation. I must have seen your notes. And the word that came to my mind was a muddle, a bit of a muddle, if I'm honest. Another way to describe it would be a crossroads. Not quite sure where to go next. There's some of the phrases that I used to describe certainly regional media, certainly the print and online landscape at the minute. For years and years and years and years and years, newspapers were very comfortable doing what they're doing. They had a monopoly. It was newspapers in particular were effectively a license to print money. The internet. I know I'm going to talk about the internet now like it's still something that's relatively new, but and it's balmy that we're here sort of I will be treating it like it is, but the internet has come along and over the course of the last 15, 20 years completely changed absolutely everything. And as an industry, I think, and I will hold my hands up to being part of the industry, none of what I say today is going to be about finger pointing or anything like that, because I've been part of trying to find the answers just as much as Mike has and Claire has and former colleagues have. The industry has been pretty poor, in my opinion, and pretty slow to react to the challenges that online has brought. And other media, other industries, the likes of Google, Facebook, etc., have just stolen a march on a lot of the ground that the media have. BBC, perhaps you could say, is an example of where they have been good at kind of really changing as the media landscape changed. But in the field that I've primarily worked in, I feel that we've been very, very kind of slow to work out what to do. And now the crossroads that I describe is, do you charge? Is content online free? If you do that, there's loads of adverts. What's the future of newspapers if everyone's going to online? It's all still up in the air, and no one, from what I've seen and from my experience, really knows the answer. Now, I have my own views, and I'm sure we'll come on to this as to what some of the answers are. But go back to your question. That's where I'd say that the kind of landscape in terms of my area of expertise is at a muddle, trying to work out what to do next and how to safeguard the next 30 to 50 years. Mike?
To be fair to the DCMS, I think there are grounds for pessimism. However, I'm an eternal optimist. And Dave talks about change, and there's been more. I mean, every industry has had change for decades, but my entire career has been one where I've been facing change. I arrived. My first job was on the Beccles and Bungay Journal. In Beccles' office, where there were at that time 4 full-time reporters covering the Waveney Valley, and I arrived the week that hot metal printing ended at what was then Eastern Counties newspapers. 4 years later, I moved across the car park from Rouen Road to Anglia House, to Anglia Television as it was then, and that was the last week that Anglia News was shot on film. So, everything was changing, and of course everybody was going, "Oh, it's all changing. Nothing's going to be the same. Is this going to be a good idea? Is this going to be a bad idea?" And at that time, a bit like Dave was saying, that the newspaper industry was seen as a bit of a license to print money. One of the chief executives of an ITV company, not Anglia, famously said in public, "ITV is a license to print money," because it was the only place that advertisers could hit millions of eyeballs at once. And it was millions. I mean, soap operas would get over 20 million viewers a night or whatever. Audiences which now people would sort of die for, really. And so when I joined, which was the mid-'80s, I always think the ITV gravy train was just pulling into a siding, really. It was, things were not coming off the rails by any means, but they were changing. And for the first time, I mean, I never heard the word budget for the first few years that I worked in television. It was very different. Then along came Channel 4 and Channel 5. And then, as Dave says, along came the internet, the World Wide Web, as we called it to start with. And that changed everything. Yeah. And to be honest, the only thing that hasn't changed is the pace of change. And if anything, it's speeded up. Dave talked about being at crossroads. I think we've just been facing crossroads all the time. But going back to where I started, I actually think there are far more grounds for optimism than pessimism. But the key is funding, and quite where that comes from, is what we're probably going to be discussing at some length today.
Claire, you have responsibility for safeguarding, shepherding. Can you shepherd green roots? I'm not sure. I'll check that out. Safeguarding the green shoots of journalism as they push their way through the earth and out into this maelstrom, this muddle, as Dave calls it. What do you think? Where are we?
I think Dave's right. I think we are in a period of muddly change, but at the same time, I think that's actually quite exciting at the same time. So we have seen Dave's background's in print. Mike comes from telly. My background's in radio. So I've seen as well, like you guys, I've seen a lot of changes over the years in terms of longer programs, bigger teams, things shrinking down. We're in a building which was the home of Heart Radio. They moved out to go back to Milton Keynes and left us without a base for commercial radio in the city for the Heart Group at least. So yes, things are changing. What's changed, not just the internet, well, what's also changed is social media. So social media, over and above the internet, has changed the way people consume news and the way that they look at news and the way that news is distributed. And that has made the bigger difference, I would argue, than just the coming along of the internet. So we need to adapt and change to all of that. And that's part of what we're doing and thinking about that. Linear television, linear radio becomes a lot less important now. We've seen that the BBC are merging their two news channels into one, BBC World and BBC News Channel for domestic news, and they've had to cut a load of presenters. Linear news becomes less important. When I speak to the young people who you've been speaking to today, most of them never watch a TV news bulletin. And I know that's a terrible thing to admit for journalism and media students, but it's just not in their habit. It's not their habit. They consume news on the fly, on their phones, on the go. And that's why all of this change is happening and why it still needs to happen, and we need to adapt to it.
Well, it puts me slightly in mind of the Casey Musgraves lyric, "It is what it is till it ain't anymore." And one of the things I find quite interesting is to pick up Dave's point about how it's funded. Now, I, in the course of reading through various bits and pieces, noticed that if you're talking about subscription models, that is, somebody goes to a website, puts in their credit card details and their name, and they can access this. What we used to do this all the time because I had a background in small p politics, access the EDP and go flicking through and then saving the PDF of wherever my boss at the time had appeared. And apparently in Norway, 45% of the population have a news subscription. In the US, that's 21%. In the UK, it is 8%. Yeah. And of that 8%, 3% is at the local news. Yeah. So I suppose that without getting too downbeat about it, and what we really want to focus on, what can we do? Is that the right answer? Why do you think that in this country and I will bring it down to the East of England fairly soon, but why are we so resistant to that? And we start with you, Dave, and then we'll go to Claire and Mike.
I don't necessarily think resistance is the word. I think habit is the word. There's lots of talk in the industry, you know, was the big mistake at the start to provide everything for free, and then people get into the habit of getting their news for free, and then when other channels come along, social media come along, and they realise actually if they're asked to pay for it, they can still get a certain element of it for free elsewhere. There's a resistance to pay. But, you know, trends change. I don't think that necessarily, that figure, I know those figures and they're pretty gloomy, and I would, as editor of EDP, I would look at those figures, and we at one point were very much going down the route of let's see if we can get a subscriber base, and that was obviously a figure that was a big concern. But, you know, things do change, patterns and trends do change. I think one of the things that we haven't discussed yet, and I think is really important to establish at the start, is about demand. Is there a demand for news and information and journalism in the first place? And I think it's really important, from my opinion, the one thing that hasn't changed in however many hundreds of years of journalism, or in the last 20 years, is the demand for news and information. And I see that in the figures that I used to have at the Eastern Daily Press, and you see that in how people react to news. I believe that there's still fundamentally a desire from people to know what's happening on their doorstep, to know what planning issues are happening, to know whether someone's going to be building something down their street, to know what's happening at the local hospital, to know whether there's been a crash down the road. People are still interested in that sort of stuff. And Claire talked about young people. Now, obviously, it'd be easy to talk about a generation that we are. We're an older generation, 40 plus, however old all of us are. One of the big debates are young people still interested in news and what's happening around them? And I also would say, yes, 100% they are. And I think we've seen Brexit has had an impact on that. You know, lots of younger generations feeling like it was something they didn't get a say on, and now it's being it's impacting their lives. We've seen that with the environment growing as an issue, and, you know, protests around climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So the demand is there. And really, the conundrum, and to go back to your kind of question at the start around funding, the demand is there. The conundrum is how to kind of make money out of that demand. And for me, there isn't one answer. There's a whole host of answers. There's a menu of answers, because some people are prepared to consume their news in one way. They don't want to pay for it, so they might be able to put up with more adverts. Other people, you know, might be prepared to pay for it, and therefore they won't get adverts. The key to all of that, for me to finish on, so I don't want to dominate this whole podcast, is the quality. People will want and will demand a level of quality. Now, that doesn't just mean that every story's got to be Pulitzer Prize journalism. I think that does mean that for a certain audience, it does have to be, but it has to be quality. It has to be written well. It has to be accurate. It has to be quick. It has to be fast. Whatever you're trying to get out of news, quality has to be at the heart of it. And that, again, is something that newsrooms across the country are really struggling with, that kind of balance of how do we keep the quality high.
I agree that people are interested. They are absolutely desperately interested to find out what's happening in their local area. They want to know about what's happening in the world. They also don't want information overload, right? So there's a balance to be struck with not giving people so much news that they feel depressed and disempowered, but actually enough news that they feel like they know what's going on. I think there's an education to be done, and some news organisations have not really done this, about valuing the news and what it is worth. The Guardian's very good at this. Every time you click on The Guardian, it says, we do this, we think you should pay for it, and we think we're worth paying for. And after a while, if you've got a bit of money, you give in and you give them $5 a month, right? So I think the BBC have started that process of making these promos. We are wonderful. This is why you should be paying your TV licence. So I think there's an education that needs to happen around the audience. Journalism costs money. It's an important good for society. Therefore, you should pay for it. Just like you pay for Netflix or you pay for Amazon Prime. Everything costs money. Nothing is for free. But I think through these last 20 years of internet and social media, as David says, we've got used to getting it for free. We've got used to getting it for free on our mobile phones. A lot of the publishers missed a trick by giving a lot of it away. And so those habits have got to a difficult place. And I also think that the standards, Dave started on this, have to be incredibly high, right? So you look, I don't know what the press is like in Norway particularly, but I'm sorry, a lot of the national press are pretty poor in terms of the way that they do some stories. There are a lot of very sexist, racist stories. that I'm afraid young people today are just not going to pay for at all, because they absolutely fundamentally disagree with the way that the national tabloid press treats some stories.
Mike, do you want to offer us a broadcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting from a broadcast point of view, or from a television point of view, that news is very expensive to make, and fundamentally, leaving Sky News to one side, which actually, they do a very good job, but it's very much national and international. But in terms of regional news, the BBC do it, funded by the licence fee, therefore most of us pay. And actually ITV do it, and of course it still costs millions and millions and millions. It doesn't generate advertising, but it's a key part of the ITV brand, and has become a more important part of the ITV brand actually since the pandemic. And we'll probably come on to how many people consume their news in what way. But, more people are watching ITV Anglia news now than they were in 2015, which is, remarkable, really. And I think I did a quick sum on the back of an envelope. And I think on an average night in the week in the east of England, about 1 in 7, 1 in 8 people will watch regional news of one side or another. Some of them watch both, I think. But I think and of course people on ITV are watching ITV think they're getting it for free, but the advertising pays for it. Not entirely now. There are different funding models, but the advertising broadly pays for it. But part of the cost of everything we buy in the shop is the cost of advertising. So we're all paying one way or another.
One of the things that really interested me about the conversation about what we just heard there is talking about breaking stories. Now, by the time a news crew can be on scene, I mean, I date back when the first we might often hear of a story was when Andrew Sinclair or Emma Hutchinson was at the door wanting to talk to my boss. But these days, Twitter is straight there, and it's I suppose. From your guys, David and Mike's point of view, how that's impacted, how that changes the offer of local news, how what you do to change the offer to come against that, and really then I come on to ask Claire, how do you integrate that into the syllabus, into what you're teaching these guys? So
I think this comes down again to quality and sort of value, really. You don't just want the news to tell you what's happening, but you want the news to help you to inform you, to help you to form your own opinions. We would talk a lot about not just saying this has happened, but how do you add analysis to that? How do you add depth to that? Because there's two reasons why you'd want to do that. One is it's good journalism, but for the reader, for the consumer, for the viewer, they're getting more out of it. And at the end of, I would always aim with an addition of the EDP, for instance. I would always think, well, by the time someone's put that down, I want them to have felt something or feel like something has changed. They might have been made to laugh. They might have been made to cry. They might have been moved to contribute to something, whether that's to put their name down on a petition or to help someone in a charity appeal, or they might know something that they didn't know otherwise. If you could get one of those 6 things, and I think you provided value for money, and hopefully the reader could see that you had it, that there was a value in that product. And I think that is a key point. You can't rely on the breaking news. I still think that you can, to an extent, still utilise that, because obviously one of the things that media have is a tremendous reach. So yes, you might grab something on Twitter, but it ain't instantly going to be everywhere. Often it's your news organisations that will spread that. But I do think the challenge is added value. What can you add that is different to what you can just get elsewhere, or by sort of having a look on the internet yourself?
Well, I'll just before I jump to Mike, is that you in the kind of the WhatsApp chat we had setting this up, you brought the case of Nicola Bulley up, and why I raise that now is that yes, police forces will put out their tweets, but there is still a press conference, and there is still a table with a police officer or multiple police officers and witnesses and what have you. Mike, in terms of breaking news, and journalists are trained to ask those questions, aren't they? They're trained to sit there and interrogate in a way that people like me just aren't.
Yeah, I think in terms of broadcast, and again, I'm sort of thinking about regional television news. Really, there's almost now two parallel things going on. Online, the ITV Anglia news service online is more reactive, obviously, because it's quicker. You haven't got to go out and film something necessarily, and they cover a lot of court stories. They cover all sorts of things which don't always make the programme at 6 o'clock. In fact, quite often they don't. No. Or if they do, they're just a nib, a news in brief item. Whereas you get to 6 o'clock, and for some, mercifully, quite a lot of people, it's still an appointment to view. They'll sit down with the tea, or they'll have it on in the corner, and get that in-depth analysis. The other thing I think is key from a broadcast point of view and a visual medium is personalities. And, we work very hard in terms of the way, I think Anglia would big us up, but I think we've got, two brilliant presenters who work really well together and have a real affinity with the audience. They're both from the region, and ITV News generally all around the country has a really strong team, as does the BBC, of course. Interestingly, because of the BBC cuts and the fact that we may come onto this, they're now starting to divert finances into digital away from TV and radio. They've gone down to one presenter, and they've gone down to one programme covering the whole of the east of England. So if you live in Milton Keynes, you're going to hear about Cromer, whereas on Anglia, you won't. Just get that in.
Get that plug in.
Just get that in.
Claire.
I think we do a lot of different things, and we're evolving the courses all the time. Yesterday, we ran a breaking news exercise for about 40-odd students and I'm going to just... This genuinely was pretend. We told them that the Bacton gas terminal had blown up. It hasn't. It hasn't. But we told them it had. And we all pretended to be the villagers, and we pretended to be the shopkeepers, and they had to ring us up in the old-fashioned way that you would. But as well, they were pretending to gather. How would they gather from Facebook and Twitter and Insta and TikTok and all of that? So it's bringing those old journalistic skills, phoning people up, talking to them, and bringing in the new journalistic skills of scraping things through social media, but not forgetting, I need my copyright permission, who owns the copyright on that photograph. So there's all these new skills that you've got to teach them as well. And David talked about analysis. That analysis is not just happening in the papers, and it's not just happening on TV. It's also now happening on Instagram and TikTok. Yeah, so you're getting people making these videos, giving their insight, giving their analysis on a story. So it's still happening, but the platforms are shifting. So we need to adapt to that.
As in, if I'm going back to Nicola Bully, was her name, the missing woman who's probably in the river. Really interesting. I saw on TikTok actually yesterday someone who apparently, I have no idea about her credentials, was a body language expert, and just put herself up there after the press conference that the boyfriend or partner or husband of Nicola had done, and started analysing his body language and basically saying, look, well, dodgy. Well, this, and I have no idea who she was, but she just popped up in my TikTok stream, and she will have done on lots of others because I certainly don't follow her. And so I think that it comes back to credibility, doesn't it? And credentials.
Yeah, and there's a real danger in that, isn't there? And I think that's the difficulty. That's part of the kind of media savvy education that we give our young people now about what are the sources that you can trust, and obviously the BBC and ITV and EDP building a brand which says you can trust us, we're trained, we're reliable, we're going to check it out before we put it out. Yeah, you don't get that so much on those social media platforms, but at the same time, that's where a lot of their information is coming from. So it's a tricky one. It's a really tricky one.
I mean, I just to go back to my experience briefly, I had hostile interview training. Not that I mean, the first interview I actually gave was post my political career, but I had hostile interview training where I was being harangued about my links to onshore green wind power slush funds that didn't exist. I have access to no slush funds, more's the pity. But I mean, it's a really good point, because there's people like me who basically time on my hands and I blunder in and make stuff up. Not make stuff up, but make all this up as I go along, and I'm beholden to nobody. There's the great wide world of the internet where it's I'm saddled myself up with my cowboy hat on and rode into town. Nobody asked me, and I'm, as I say, not accountable. Accountability is an important and a hugely important part of the service that local media offers. Dave, you alluded to this earlier, talking about planning. I know that's a big thing that the EDP does talk about a lot, and for their demographic, it is a huge issue. It is a huge issue. And in terms of holding local councils to account, which only happens on a national level in the most disastrous of circumstances, that's absolutely vital. And Mike, I mean, if you're looking at ITV Anglia, you've got things like Northamptonshire, which I know quite well, where basically the Northamptonshire County Council fell over. Local national government rode in and reorganised it, whether the local people wanted it reorganised or not, and that made the national news, but it was led locally. How quantify for us how important that role is?
I'd say it's huge, and we covered that Northamptonshire story, week in, week out for months. Another one that Dave will obviously be very well across is the Norfolk and Suffolk Mental Health Trust and the East Anglian Ambulance Trust. These are stories that run and run and run, and one hopes that slowly but surely improvements will be made, although it does seem to be very slowly and not very surely. But I do wonder, without that constant pressure from the local media, whether that change would happen at all.
I think you talked about some big examples there, and another massive example I'll give on that is COVID. I know we don't want to go back there, but I remember saying to my team at the time, there's no bigger hyper-local story than this. The situation around COVID, let's go back, people were in panic mode. No one knew what to believe. There was, conspiracy theories flying around everywhere. But the situation in Cromer was completely different to the situation in Great Yarmouth, which was completely different to the situation in Lowestoft. And without a strong local media to tell people about that, how would people know what to make of it, what to understand, what to act? It's so important. But just finally, that's the big stuff. And I just don't think we should undervalue the small stuff, the stuff that matters massively to 8 people. That's the sort of stuff that local media has to be there for, because if they're not, no one is. And that really, really worries me. That's terrible for democracy, and that is a real disaster for our communities.
And local radio has actually been really, really good at that over the years. If you look at what the BBC local radio stations have been able to do, they have had majority speech-based programmes in the mornings and majority speech-based programmes at drive time, and they have been able to get their counsellors in, they've been able to get people in from the Mental Health Trust, and really, really dig in and give them, let's give them a 7-minute interview. I know that sounds like not a long time, right? But give them a long interview and really challenge them on what they're doing. So it's been fantastic that the BBC local radio stations have been able to do that. It's a shame, unfortunately, that their services are being cut back under the current situation, but they'll still be able to do that at breakfast time, which is so, so, so important for people to have that opportunity. We did it, Dave and myself. We had a local politics programme on television, local Mustard TV in Norwich. We did that for 3 years. And that was great as well. When we had the Rainbow Coalition on the Norfolk County Council, we were able to hold them to account on what they did. We had politicians, we had debates for local elections as well. And without that scrutiny, all sorts of things could possibly fly under the radar and happen that we don't know about, but we need to know about.
Absolutely, and just from my point of view as someone with experience in that political world, I remember one of the most exciting days in my career was the expenses scandal, the day that broke. Yes, that was broken by the Daily Telegraph, but my boss was not worried about the Daily Telegraph. He was worried about ITV Anglia. He was worried about Look East. He was worried about the EDP and the Dis Express. And we really sort of had to race to wherever he was that morning and sit around in a pub in Halston, as it turns out, and strategize and what are we going to do? Yeah. And it was that local focus, because that is where most of the people who really cared about what their MP hadn't done could be found.
There's so much about that example that just wouldn't have been known about, and I think it led to so much more scrutiny, and it led to some real terrible examples of where people were just taking the mickey out of the system, and and really not serving their constituents to the best of their ability. So it's a great example, broken by a national newspaper, but only the regional media can really go down to that grassroots level and cover the people that matter to the people who are watching that programme or reading that newspaper.
I've long been a huge fan of local radio. In fact, the first time I came into this building, it was Radio Broadland, when I think there were 6, maybe 8 journalists working here full time when it went on air. But I'm just really trying to think of which Prime Minister, because there's been so many in the last few months. I think it was the current one. I think it was Rishi Sunak, before Christmas, decided to do a tour. I think it was around about the time of the party conferences, and he decided that he was just going to be interviewed by local radio. Was it Rishi or was it Liz?
Well, I think it might
Maybe
have been
Liz.
Maybe it was Liz,
because
it was Liz. She ended up in Leeds, where she got an absolute grilling.
Well, I mean,
a car crash
silly them thinking that local radio is going to give you an easy ride.
Yeah.
You're right. It was Liz Truss.
Such an important example. That is such an important example, because it is exactly that. It was thought, no one's going to pay any attention. We'll be fine. And
of course, every local radio station, right? This is our local issue. What do you know? You who want to be or are now Prime Minister, what do you know about the Queen Elizabeth Hospital? Whatever. Yeah. And I am slightly worried about the fact that the BBC are diverting funds away from local radio, and it's becoming less local.
And I think one of the key points that to follow up from there is that there are still, in the regionals, there are fantastic journalists out there. My concern is that because of the way that pay has changed, because of the way that newsrooms have changed, and because of the way that large companies have come in and just homogenised everything and stripped away some of that quality, it's harder to come by. It's harder to come by that quality journalism. It's still there. There are some fantastic journalists across the board in this region, but hand on heart, there aren't as many as there were. And I say that as someone who hates people who say things were better in my day. I'm talking I still see my day as now. Hand on heart, I know that the level of journalism is not as high as it was, and that's a real problem.
And maybe that's because is it harder to retain staff if the salaries are not there? Because what worries me really is about young people going into the industry, unless they've got wealthy parents, right? If they're going to be asked to do long periods of work on rubbish salaries or long periods of work of internships which are not paid, they can't do that. So you don't get the people from ordinary working class backgrounds. You don't get them from, black and Asian minority ethnic groups, because they just can't afford to do it. Or they get fed up when they can't career progress and make enough money to, buy a house and look after their kids and stuff like that.
Well, what we're seeing is lots of the best journalists, unfortunately, go into PR, and because they're the best journalists, they've got the nous to know how to get the stories written in a certain way to get them into the media. And because maybe the newsrooms don't have the experience that they used to have, they're getting through the filters, and actually, that over time is quite unhealthy for democracy as well.
I mean, that is a skill. You're absolutely right. That is a skill to be able to write those press releases, because, I mean, look who I'm talking to, but I've seen it done both ways, and I've always tried to write those and know for whom you are writing. When you want to get your boss on the front cover, when he was on the Public Accounts Committee, on the front cover of the Daily Mail, you've got to major in outrage. That's what you've got to write to. You don't, but it's a completely different thing when you want to get in the EDP, when you want to attract the attention of Emma Hutchinson or Andrew Sinclair.
But when you have less experience, when you don't have those sort of journalists that have done it for 25, 30 years in the newsroom, it's easier to manipulate that. And I think that's where where the danger comes.
And I know, having also run a charity in the region for a while, and with a sort of journalistic hat on as well, or half on, I knew that if I wrote a press release or worked with someone who did our PR on a press release, and it was modelled for the Eastern Daily Press or whatever, you'd send it in with a nice picture, there was a pretty good chance it was going to go in pretty much as was. And that's not a criticism. That's just because the resource is not there to pick up the phone and if it's well produced, it'll get in.
Absolutely.
Which is, we were writing nice stories about charities, but you could see how that could be manipulated.
100%.
Yeah, Claire, do you want any reflection on that? No, you're shaking your head, which I was hoping you would
She
give me
agrees
time,
entirely.
because I was chasing after the train of thought that was pulling out of the station without me. Claire, your students, how many of those would you say are actively saying, I actually want to focus locally? And if they are, is it a kind of a hyper-local thing that technology allows you to do? Or is that local aspect very much somewhere they know they have to pass through on the way to bigger and better things?
It's a real mixture. Some of them dream of, 5 Live and Radio 1 and World Service and all of that kind of stuff. And some of them are really, really happy doing hyper-local news stories and digging them out and just finding out the stories that are happening in their local area. I think they get a huge sense of achievement at finding those little local stories, which they can turn around and tell what's going on and find stuff out when things are going wrong, when stuff's broken, or they can tell those people's stories. I think they get a huge sense of achievement out of that. And then from that, they move on and they spread. I've got a lot of students who are desperate to work at ITV Anglia. They keep coming to me and going, how can I get into Anglia? I really want to work there. I love it.
One of my very, very fond memories, because I love working with young journalists and trainee journalists, was one of Claire's former students who came to us hoping to get a traineeship, and ringing her up and saying, you're in. And she was so emotional. And she said, all I ever wanted to do was work for ITV Anglia. And, I thought that was fantastic. And it's great to hear there are more. Unfortunately, there's only ever one traineeship per year.
So yeah. One of the things I want to come on to sort of the East of England specifically, and looking at the various ways the East of England represents itself to itself in a second. But Dave, I think it was Dave used the word rubbish earlier, and that got me thinking, wait a minute, that you're not talking about the usual content of my podcast, which is, and by the way, not for nothing, but if any students want to come and shadow and do some interviewing, I'm more than happy to give them that opportunity, because I think people probably are sick of the sound of my voice by now. But I remember many times going to village halls and watching my boss cut the ribbon on a village hall which was funded by Biffa waste credits. And part of the committee report, which thankfully we've moved past now, is talking about Google and Meta sort of sponsoring this and that and the other, thinking basically what you're talking about is a social media waste credit. And I don't, personally speaking, don't see that as a constructive way to move the industry forward. That basically this is some money that the social media giants are giving you as a bit of an apology for being a bit naff. Yeah. And I'll start with Claire and Mike and then Dave.
Well, I'm interested to hear from Dave's experience, because I know that one of my graduates came to work for you as a Facebook reporter, didn't he? So that was a great opportunity for him to dig in as the Fakenham reporter, right? And, what on earth is going on in Fakenham? Well, you would think nothing, but there he was. He did really well. Did it work?
So that was a scheme that Facebook would, across the country, including in Norfolk, would pay for reporters to either cover an area or a subject that maybe was otherwise going missing. So we did, at the time, had Fakenham reporter and a Down and Market reporter, and yes, it worked, because the coverage in those areas was absolutely fantastic. We Down and Market and Fakenham got loads more stories because of it, but that's not the answer. I agree with you, Mike. I do think that there is a levy or a tax or whatever you want to call it for the likes of Facebook and Google to pay, because they have for years taken that content that's being produced by media that are paying a lot of money for it. But as an industry, you can only rely on handouts so much. If we seriously think as an industry that the future is about handouts, whether it's from the government or from Facebook or Google or whoever, then that is I think really sad and also quite worrying. We've got to find a way to stand on our own 2 feet. Journalism's got to remain independent. I think great if they're going to be taking stuff from the government, that is going to potentially put into people's minds all sorts of questions. Are they going to question, the independent nature of it? As an industry, we kind of have to stop feeling sorry for ourselves. We kind of have to stop saying, oh, well, the internet's come along and ruined everything for us. Maybe just to admit to the mistakes that we've made, try new things, try different ways of working. Don't just all go down the same path, which is unfortunately, as far as the world that I've been in, my fear is that lots of media are going down the same path and potentially making lots of the same mistakes. We can't just rely on handouts. We have to find a way to stand on our own 2 feet. And to do that, you have to be prepared to invest a little bit. Some of these companies are still making a lot of money. It is hard for that money to come by, but you have to trial new things, invest in a little bit, put the onus back onto quality and see where it goes.
Yeah, and I'm still flying the ITV flag. ITV is investing hugely in news, and trying different things. So there is a number of daily podcasts and video, because ITV is really about TV, has access to a lot more video, which can be quite expensive for other organisations. But now with the launch of ITVX, which is sort of like a BBC iPlayer type platform, but for the first time it includes at the moment just online, but it will be on the app as well. It includes a news service which is kind of hybrid. It's so you go to ITVX, and I did it this morning just to check it's all working on a web browser, and you scroll down to what they're calling a rail of news stories, and so you can basically say, I'm interested in that one, I'm interested in that one, I'm interested in that one. It will be there's an opening link from a recognised ITV news reader, and then you're straight into a video report, which could be shot and cut specially for ITVX, or it could be reversioned from a broadcast linear TV story. Now that is going to be rolled out across the regions sometime later this year. So that's a kind of video on demand news service, which is new.
They're creating their own running order.
So they're creating their own running order.
Oh my goodness, I have to change my lessons.
So but that's an example, and it may work, it may not, it may work for a bit, and then something else will happen. I mean, one thing we learned very quickly is that if you're relying on social media platforms, if you don't own the platform, if you don't control the platform, you're completely at the behest of Facebook's algorithms or whatever. And they change all the time. They can just randomly one day say, I don't think we want to see less of that or want more of that or whatever. So you're always playing catch up. Whereas, I think if you can, going back to the subscription thing we were talking about earlier, and perhaps we'll come on to that, I do think that is the way forward, and then provide a service that people can fashion how they want it. I think that might well be the way forward.
I mean, it's interesting. What I find interesting is your former colleagues, Insight Energy is a production that /News Quest put out for the sector. Is there a certain amount of future? And I started thinking about this when I was in Cambridge and saw the various sort of Cambridge things that are funded, obviously, by a lot of people want to access students. And, there are still print newspapers called the Cambridge Independent floating around Cambridge. But is the future more in kind of much more niche audiences for particular? I mean, Norwich City fans, for one example, or slightly broader football fans in the east of England or in Norfolk or what have you. Is that, perhaps start with you, Mike, again, is that niche, is there a niche audience?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I was just picking up on something Dave said earlier about the Facebook reporter that could be for a location or for a subject. And I think the DCMS report that you referred to right at the beginning talked about the importance of community cohesion that local media provided. But communities can be geographical or communities of interest. And I think either of those, can be a source of revenue. The Pink 'Un is behind a paywall, isn't it? Right. And clearly, I don't know what the figures are, but clearly, football fans, Norwich City fans, are probably prepared to pay for what is pretty much unique content. We did some research for ITV Regional News, and we were looking, sort of trying to assess the way forward for regional news as opposed to local, and it was interesting. I sat in sort of unobserved on various discussion groups and focus groups, and I remember somebody very clearly from Swaffham saying, well, if I want to know what's going on in Swaffham, I go to Facebook. There's 2 or 3 Facebook groups about what's going on in Swaffham now. Not very much moderated, not very much necessarily in terms of reliability, but so I think people, if you provided a really good, bespoke, high quality news service for Norwich, for instance, which, someone who we know is starting to look at, then I think people will pay for that.
I did have a kind of a flash to a semi-Life of Brian, Monty Python's Life of Brian moment.
I often have that effect on people.
Are you the news forum for fakenum? Off with the fake forum for news? How dare you? And you've got to know the right, what's the right group, what's the wrong group, and that's kind of thing one would hope.
I think the tricky thing is, though, is that audience big enough?
Yeah.
Have they got enough money to pay for it? And are they willing to pay for it?
I
So
think
that's the tricky thing, isn't it? So with the
think that-
Pinkin, yes, maybe,
Yeah.
but not necessarily with other things.
the Pinkin's been really successful, and I think that's a great example of a model that could work. But to go right back to the start, there's a reason it's been successful: exclusivity and equality.
Yeah.
It's people, personalities. You touched on personalities, Mike. It's people who are writing Norwich City content who people respect. They respect what they write. They can't get it for free. But I think the Pinkin's a really interesting model, because for me, if to go back to your question, that for me is really one of the models, because I think there's many that could work for regional media. You've got to give people what they want. There will be a proportion of people out there who will never pay for news. That's gone. But they still want to know a basic level of news. But equally, I believe there's a proportion of people out there who care deeply and want and are prepared to pay for news, but it has to be of quality. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're told everything that's going on in Norfolk or going in Norwich, but they're given kind of a real in-depth view on the big issues, the issues that interest them, the issues that matter to them. For me, I think that, that's where the media's got to go. It's got to realise that it's not a one-size-fits all approach, and that you can adapt. I think out in the hyperlocals, we do have in Norfolk some quite hyperlocal magazines. Certainly up in North Norfolk, there's the Just Regional Group. They do a great job, but it's tough. It's tough to stay relevant, and it's they probably would, if they were here now, and I know the guys who run it, they would probably say, we're not doing the kind of most hard-hitting journalism, but it is stuff that matters to people. So I think we'll see loads of different models emerge, and that's really what needs to happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
And in the radio sector, things are changing as well anyway. So even though Heart Radio have moved out of Norwich, what we do have is Greatest Hits Radio. It's run by Bauer, and they're recruiting all the time. I hear from them all the time. They're looking for reporters in Essex and Suffolk, and in Norfolk. They've taken a number of my students on, and these are reporters who are doing content for their radio bulletins, but they're also doing little videos for online as well. So yeah, okay, the majority of their output is music radio, not so much news, but they're still providing a local service of local news, on, as you say, perhaps not the most, Pulitzer Prize winning stuff, but it's stuff that people are interested in. It's stuff that people are wanting. So there is still a market for that hyperlocal news, and sometimes it's on radio, sometimes it's in a newsletter, sometimes it's online.
When you were showing us your wall of students when we came in the building,
my wall of fame,
my
successful students,
and what a thing to aspire to be on a wall of fame. But one of your students was in financial publications, and would there be, do you think, a future for sort of not necessarily financial, although obviously Norwich is a huge centre for finance, one of the biggest in the country. Would, for example, politics, I would say politics, wouldn't I? Would that have a kind of more local aspect? Because you're never shy of people who want to be in front of a camera or behind a microphone.
I'm actually going to say environmental issues are huge. A massive issue, particularly in the eastern region. We're talking coastal erosion. We're talking, wind farms. We're talking solar farms. There is a huge interest in environmental climate change news. And when you get people who are of a scientific bent, who understand science and who understand how to report science, a lot of journalists, to be honest, most of us, I don't know, can't speak for Mike and Dave, but a lot of us came from a humanities background. Okay, yes, humanities. I perhaps don't understand science as well as I would like to. So I think there's going to be huge growth in that kind of thing. And as we were saying, if you've got a niche publication, then people will say, oh, actually, it's worth me having that. It's worth me paying for that. Whether it's a local publication in Northampton, for example, covering all the things that go on in Northampton, there's a heck of a lot going on down there, or whether it's actually, a subject base, something environmental, something perhaps political as well.
I think I interviewed, I use the word loosely in this company, but I interviewed Asher Minns at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research, and he was very, very good, and he was saying how, Scotland's rising, which means East Anglia is tipping into the sea, and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to pause now while I wipe
renew
the
my house
sweat from
insurance.
my brow and phone my insurer. Yeah,
I had a slight flashback then to a science series, the only science series I've ever made, which was some time ago now. Dr. Mary Archer presented it. But I have this horror of going to Cambridge, which is stuffed full of very, very clever people, and saying to this sort of Nobel Award prize-winning scientist, could you sort of sum up your life's work in 45 seconds? You know, and then trying to do pieces to camera where you would then try and say what they've done in 45 seconds, and they'd be surrounded by people. All I remember being in white coats, probably not anymore, just scratching their heads and going, no, you can't say that. It was totally hideous. But there are very clever scientists out there who can actually explain what they're doing, so
Yes.
that would be good.
Yes, there are some fantastic science communicators as well, and we're really blessed to have quite a lot of those in our region. I'm thinking of Maddie Moat, particularly if you've got kids my age. Not kids my age, kids of the same age as mine. Thank you. That one's going to get cut out. That's why I love doing this, because some of my more exaggerated wibbling on can be excised and left on the cutting room floor. We are, as you all know, in National Apprenticeships Week. And I
don't know why, Mike. That sort of seemed to have passed me by, but that's marvellous.
We are, I promise you, in National Apprenticeships Week. And one of the things that the National Council for the Training of Journalists has spoken about is getting 70 apprentices into newsrooms, 2 per county of the 27 counties of England, for 2 years. And I'll start with Claire. What's your reaction? I mean, do you have any kind of interaction with that? And what's your views on that? I mean, is that just an unalloyed good thing as far as your people are concerned?
I think apprenticeships are a really good idea because not everybody has the time or the money to go to university. So years ago, decades ago, organisations like local newspapers used to train their own staff, and they would send them off to college for day release for their law and their shorthand, and then they would carry on working for the rest of the week. There became a shift a couple of decades ago where the organisation said, do you know what? This is all a bit expensive, isn't it? Actually, I think we'll just outsource it all to the universities. And the universities went, lovely, we can make some, we can make some lovely new courses and it'll all be fantastic. So I think, there is obviously a massive place for university education for journalism. I would say that. I'm a course leader and I love it. But I do think for some students, it's better for them to take the apprenticeship route because then they're in employment from the start, and it's less of a financial burden for them. And it's like I said to you, it's about opening up a more diverse group of journalists, right? So not everybody fits in with the university model. Some people are much better in the workplace. And how we do it, well, I think we can do it in lots of different ways. We don't just have to do it through everybody doing a 3-year degree.
I think that's absolutely key around the diversity, and it's not, diversity of people from different races, different backgrounds, different upbringings. If you are just relying on, newsrooms can be quite middle class, and that again is the danger. Is it reflective of the audience? Is it reflective of the readers and the issues that they're facing? So I think, the apprenticeship thing is a really useful way to get people into a newsroom who might not have otherwise had the chance. And if they can't afford to go to university, but they just happen to be so passionate about the area they cover, and also have great contacts because they've lived in that area and they've lived an interesting life in that area, they're going to be brilliant journalists. And if they're brilliant journalists, they're going to go on to do some great stories, which is obviously going to be great for the community. It's a start, but I go back to the other point I made, Mike. It's all well and good finding new schemes to bring in people at the start of their careers in, but if they're then just going to, after 3 or 4 years, go into PR or go into a different sphere altogether or leave the industry because they think, well, actually, this is really hard. It's not an easy industry to work in. It's incredibly hard to work in. It's incredibly important that it should be paid so much more than it is. If they're not going to be retained in that industry, then that there's no point. You're just training people to go and do jobs elsewhere. And again, the journalism suffers and the community suffers.
Yeah, I mean, as well, ITV is hugely committed and has really ramped up over the last few years the drive for a sort of diverse and inclusive recruitment process. And I took the decision to trial an apprentice 2 or 3 years ago. on the journalism side, we fairly regularly have apprentices on the more technical side, where there is a fairly well-established process. On the journalism side, it wasn't very established, and we were kind of in the vanguard, and we had to swap suppliers and providers during the course of the year, and it didn't work brilliantly. I think with a more structured, perhaps national apprenticeship scheme for journalism, that would be brilliant. Because, traditionally, I think you're right. It goes in cycles. Traditionally, when I started, I think a lot of the people I started with hadn't been to university. They were rooted in the local community on the EDP, and they'd be like you, Dave. They'd always wanted to work on the EDP, and for that was fantastic. And it has to be said, relatively speaking, on the EDP or at Anglia or Look East or Radio Norfolk, Radio Broadland or whatever, you were actually relatively well paid. Now, of course, the sums don't add up anymore, and if you come into ITV as a news trainee, which is hugely competitive, as Claire well knows, but it's a fantastic scheme. But I'd be the first to say, compared with when I started as a trainee, it's not that well paid. And so, once that initial you've gained all that experience, and then you might move on to a network job or a national job, or you might not. And there are people who, just for purely financial reasons are leaving. And that's very sad.
Just before we wind up, a couple more questions. But I would like to ask you all where you really would like to see local media, particularly local news media in this region, go, and how you'd like us to get there. And if perhaps start with Claire, who's now smiling, is like, oh, damn.
This is a really hard question, isn't it? I would like to see, I come from a radio background. I would like to see radio remain strong and continue to grow. It's one of the most popular ways that people receive their news, their information, because actually everybody just jumps in the car and they turn on the radio and they give a listen to it every day. So I would like to see more local radio. I'd like to see more community radio, providing that local service for people. And I'd like to see those local commercial stations and the local BBC stations in Essex, in Suffolk and in Norfolk continue to be strong and continue to grow, and have them work together with their online presence so that they can build their online communities who will come to the radio, and their radio communities will go to online. So that's where my heart is. I love radio, and I think actually a lot of people do. And bringing those communities together can provide a really strong public service for people.
I think the BBC have really cornered the market in kind of cross-pollination between radio and podcasting. One recent example that I've really enjoyed is the Gabriel Gatehouse series on QAnon. Fascinating and so well made, and it really puts my bigger efforts to shame. Dave?
Well, let's start again. We're just talking about the worlds we know. Let's start with the Eastern Daily Press, and maybe include the Norwich Evening News and the weeklies as well with this. I desperately hope that they have a future. I think they're so important to this community, and it would be a sadder place to see them go. But I think that for that to happen, there's got to be a realisation that it isn't a one-size-fits-all, and that you have to realise that the audience out there, the potential audience out there, wants different things. At the minute, I believe that too much of regional news across the country is going down the let's try and get clicks, because clicks lead to clicks on adverts online, and that's the model. It's about and that there's no denying that over time journalism is being lessened because of that, and newsrooms are being told to go for the page views, to go for the quick hits. That is fine. That is fine. That can exist. But there are people out there who want quality. There are people out there, I believe, who will pay for it. There are people out there who will want podcasts. So I hope that places like the EDP survive by kind of shape-shifting again, by realising it's not one size fits all. I just want to mention one other thing, though, if that's okay. I'm really excited to see what new might emerge, because I think during this muddle, as I described at the start, during this period of turmoil, we're going to start to see some new things emerging, and that's where I'm really excited, because we've seen in other parts of the country, I'm going to give you a couple of examples if people want to check out. There's there's a publication called the Bristol Cable.
Yes.
That was started 7 or 8 years ago. Now employs a dozen journalists, and they do fantastic analytical content about the city. It's now a fortnightly, I think, publication that came out of the website. Brilliant success. There's another one called The Mill up in Manchester, which is also really starting to make waves. In Norwich, he was due to join us today, but couldn't. I'm going to give a plug to the work that Tom Bristow is doing.
Please do.
Former investigations editor, working with myself. He has set up a website, a subscription website called the Norwich Seeker. Once a week, I'm involved in it. So, just putting that out there for fairness reasons. Once a week, we get under the skin of an issue. The model there that's being looked at is that actually that is run as a not-for-profit, that journalists write articles for it. You get some grant funding from wherever you can get that grant funding to pay for it. And then over time, you would start to ask the subscribers, of which there are already more than 500, which is a fantastic start in not a very long period of time. Over time, you get subscribers who care passionately about journalism and the local area to start to pay for that. But the other thing I'm excited about with that model is I think it's about giving people something to get behind. I kind of would almost call it rebel journalism. It's about being part of something. I think that with the Bristol Cable, with the Mill in Manchester, and hopefully with the Norwich Seeker, people feel like they're part of a movement. So it's going to be more than just the journalism. It's going to be about getting people along for a debate. It's almost like a kind of journalism club.
And is there also something about getting people to donate? That kind of buy me a coffee thing on Instagram. It's like, actually, if you really enjoyed this, just bung me a couple of quid here and there.
Making people realise it comes at a cost.
Exactly. There's a cost that you're going to give us a little bit of a donation, and that'll help keep our running costs going.
I should be doing that.
So I don't want to be, so that there are reasons to be cheerful. I think that there are some exciting positives that will emerge. For the mainstream ones, it's just kind of how agile can they be? How prepared to try new things can they be? Because if they don't do that, then there are people coming up through that will try it.
I would never have the gall to call myself a journalist, and I'm serious about that, because I'm just basically one bloke with too much time on his hands who's messing about and trying to be jolly and happy and sunshine and rainbows and everything. Mike, on the sunshine rainbow note, I come to you.
Sunshine and rainbows, absolutely. Well, I think there's two separate things I'm going to mention. One is regional TV news, because that's where I come from. And I also said that throughout my career, that's been a bit of a roller coaster ride. I think the roller coaster is very much on the up at the moment, actually. I think that, as I said, ITV are committing a lot of resource and an increasing amount of resource to regional TV news, and the number of people watching it is going up. So I think, although, there's a whole issue we haven't gone into about public service broadcasting and the fact that ITV makes news because it has to under its license with Ofcom, and those licenses are up for renewal in 2 or 3 years' time. So who knows? But all the signs are very positive that Ofcom are going to be very happy to carry on pretty much as is. And ITV are also going to be happy to carry on pretty much as is. I think so. I can say that. No, I'm not working for ITV, but I would say that's looking very positive. On the local side, I think, I completely get the point about not-for-profit. From a commercial background, I always find that slightly tricky, because I just think if it's not for profit, then it's relying on, yes, that there could be a kind of groundswell of opinion and let's get on to the club and let's make this happen. But I don't know what legs that will have. In the end, we all have to pay the mortgage and whatever. And so, but having said that, I'm now at a stage, I'd love to get involved in something like that, because, my mortgage is not as much as it used to be, and demands aren't what they were. But I do think the subscription model is one that could work. I think that those communities of interest are really important. And it's interesting. I had a conversation with Tom about the Norwich Seeker, and I said, would you not think of making it the Norfolk Seeker? And he was very focused. No, he said, no, it's about Norwich. Now, whether, you can get enough subscribers within Norwich to make it happen, I don't know. But let's really hope so. And in the end, content is king. Let's come back to where we all started, which is, if the quality is good enough, if you're learning something that you're not, or consuming something that you're not getting anywhere else, then you'll probably be prepared to pay for it.
Well, I have to say that, I do have to say it, but I've forgotten what it was. Oh, God. Oh, the polished, definitely. No, well, I remember Dave telling me this great story. Was it Port Vale, Dave?
Burton-on-Trent.
Burton-on-Trent, thank you. I don't know why I thought it was Port.
I don't even know what story you're on about. I could just guess it must have been Burton-on-Trent.
It was Burton-on-Trent. You infuriating members of the National News. Oh, there's more. Well,
they're all about Burton-on-Trent, though, so that's fine.
That was it. I can come back to that now because you were saying about content is king, and one of the reasons Dave is here is because he's one of my three golden geese, if you like, who's really kind of pushed the downloads on Eastern Promise. He's one of the three big download driving people, the other two being Saul Humphrey and George Freeman. So Dave is here to... I'm
illustrious company.
I'm riding on Dave's coattails.
Are we in the presence of an influencer?
Influencer, yes. Absolutely.
I'm not sure I've ever met an influencer. That's very exciting.
It's old to be an influencer.
I, on the other hand, am a terrible warning. And Dave told me this fantastic story about he was foxing the national news media while covering Burton-on-Trent Football Club.
That is true.
And I don't tell it again because I want people to go and check out our one-on-one interview and listen to that story in depth. But Claire and Mike, I just wondered if you had from your own personal archives another story. For example, talking about broadcast journalism students, I used to regularly, because I was I have shared with the broadcast journalism students, impersonate their interviewees for their practical. When the interviews fell through, I did. I was. I have been.
I am appalled.
I am very sorry, but I was paid in beer, which is very important. And I was at one point I was a surgeon at the Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham, and a Scottish surgeon too. I don't know how I pulled that off, and I think it was probably quite transparent, but it seems to have worked all right for them because I got paid in a lot of beer. I was also the local Liberal Democrat candidate at one point. Make of that what you will. But Claire, you must have from your archive at least one really good story about your time in the media that you can share with us.
Well, you're putting me on the spot now. Look, yeah, I mean, students, they do all sorts of cheeky things, don't they? As lecturers, you get quite good at kind of figuring out when it's fake. You know, you can kind of tell when somebody's making something up or they're reading from a script and you go, now, isn't that interesting? Where did you find that interviewee from? They seem to know their subject so well. I can't believe you've managed to do that. But no, look, I mean, I think we're trying to instill in them all sorts of, you know, good quality and high integrity in terms of what they're doing, but there's always a few cheeky ones who try and do some funny things when they run out past their deadline. They don't know what they're going to do. I just need to hand something in quickly.
No names, no pack drill. Mike.
There are so many. I'm going to go back to my very first day as a professional journalist, which, as I mentioned earlier, was on the Beccles and Bungay Journal. And I was sent out to do a golden wedding anniversary. In those days, they were newsworthy events. I think they happen all the time now. It was in Ditchingham. And I can remember exactly where it was. And I went in and it was probably about 11 o'clock in the morning. And I discovered subsequently that this happened pretty much on every Golden Wedding Anniversary story. You'd be offered a cup of tea. And
I was going to say chicken.
and a piece of cake and then a glass of sherry, even if it was 11 o'clock in the morning. And we got to the sherry stage. And the wife went out to get the sherry, and her husband leaned forward and said, "I can't stand her, you know."
Wow. And that's why he had to drink sherry at 11 in the morning.
Yeah. So I learned very quickly that there's always two sides to every story.
Oh wow.
Well, this has not just been a panel on the local news media. This has been an Eastern Promise panel on the local news media, and that sounded a lot funnier in my head about 5 seconds ago. Clare Precey from the University of East Anglia, the legend that is David Powles, and the legend that is Mike Talbot. Thank you
Claire's
very
a legend
much.
too, I have to just in my eyes anyway.
She's just achieved legendary status, clearly.
Clearly, yes.
I apologise. I should have. I couldn't. I'm going to excuse myself.
Maybe we had to do that again.
I'm going to take that from the top because I'm terribly sorry. Oh dear. Right from the top. The legend. I can't think of a superlative high enough. Then legend doesn't seem to cover it really. Clare Precey, thank you so much for hosting us in this magnificent podcasting studio, which I'm very envious of. And count all the cables and things before we leave, won't you? David Powles, thank you so much. And Mike Talbot. You've put me off now.
Now we're not legends.
Now we're not legends.
You're not legends, no. I was trained in politics where there is, I'm afraid to say, a slightly petty edge.
Now I'm going to walk out.
Go on then. The almost as legendary as Clare Precey is David Powles.
I'll take that.
And Mike Talbot, who is in his own ways.
Call me whatever you like, Mike. That's fine.
The journalistic Moses bringing tablets of stone from Mount Sinai. Thank you all so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And best of luck to you in all your endeavours, all Clare students. David, whatever it is, you keep your secrets, but whatever it is you're doing next. Mike, wherever life takes you now, because you're clearly enjoying it, whatever it is.
I am.
Thank you for giving Eastern Promise your time. Thank you all.
My pleasure.
Cheers.
My thanks to Clare Precey, Mike Talbot and David Powles for sharing what was a much more nuanced and positive picture for local media in our region than is perhaps understood elsewhere. I'm truly grateful to them for joining me, and will be returning to Broadcast House later in the year. And now, as I'm currently off on my holidays and unable to record another pulse-pounding, rib-tickling, puns-blazing crowd-sorcery... Thank you. I've reached back into the mists of time to defrost a classic from the Eastern Promise archive. Challenge Anglia. It's Telly Time. It is famously said that cinema is art, theatre is life, and television is furniture. So, let's turn on, tune in, and assemble the flat pack of televisual fun that is...
Challenge Anglia!
Some call it the haunted fish tank. Others call it the goggle box, the tube, or the digital babysitter. And it can be controlled either by a womfer, a doofer, a clicker, or a zapper. Which sounds like the roll call for the banana splits, but I digress. And ever since the Anglian knight looked east from his kingdom to the quiz of the week, live from Norwich, our region has had a huge part to play in the history of television. It is that pedigree we have come to honour, my challengers, so let's turn on our TV guides to see what we've got.
Okay.
Ooh.
The crimes you are about to hear were committed specially for this podcast.
Do you know, I'm mildly disappointed. Nobody went for Heart to Heartsease. When Norfolk and Suffolk met, it was murder. Nobody went for Happy Tass Valley. Inspector Horsey. Frost Row. Setchian Trunch. But lo, Gary Duncan of the Land and Planning Company homages one of the small screen's first coppers in Dixon of Docking Green. Evening all. Meanwhile, Top Sleuth Saul Humphrey is busy getting to the bottom of another grisly addition to a South Norfolk village's absurdly high body count in Midsummer Mundum. Ah! Oh no, another one. And when she's not hunting a murderous assassin in Killing Evesham, the ever-prolific Dr. Penny Hundleby has constructed the perfect segue from cop show to comedy with the screwball antics of Norfolk Constabulary's finest in Brookling 99. Simon Hughes, Director of Property at Norfolk County Council, tells us this has got to be the winner, 10 out of 10. Well, Simon, like Sue Gray, I can't prejudge the findings of my inquiry. Now, if you want the best puns but you don't ask questions, then brava, Chris Sargison's your man. But here's the one that's driving Chris berserk. Why do only fools and Horsford work? Christopher Raymer, Business Development Manager at Future Radio, gives us the very little-known TV hit of teens on the Yarmouth coast, California Fever. Incidentally, California Fever also starred an actor named Lorenzo Lamas, a two-tier mashup. It's always the game within the game for you guys, which I respect. Whilst Chris brings us the multi-dimensional pun,
Gary Duncan comes back with the high-frequency percussive pun, with little-known 70s Suffolk-based sitcom I Didn't Know You Cared. Then to the 80s with Nigel Havers and Dinah Sheridan in Don't Thwait Up. Keeping us in that seminal decade is Saul Humphrey with Different Stokesby, whilst Gary Duncan leaps into the 90s, pounding through the surf in slow-motion Baywatch spin-off Whiz Beach, before putting one foot in the Kesgrave. Speaking of risk, accident-prone Suffolk residents seeking £250 for falling over a castle's battlements a Penny Hundleby suggestion in You've Been Framlingham'd. Aspiring musicians in the Diss area, meanwhile, are busy signing up to Gary Duncan's Skol of Rock. But my word, what a hotbed of gossip and scandal is the southern fringe of Norwich, we hear, thanks to Ted Leggett, Culture and Events Officer at Norwich City Council, who tells us his good lady wife is genuinely a member of WhatsApp group Desperate Trousewives. Ted and Gary also lead us neatly into the world of what we loosely call reality television, with Horsey Shaw and Love Island respectively. David Parfrey, my guest from just before Christmas, takes us into the quiz show genre with Pointless, which, says David, is anywhere outside the east of England. No arguments here? And if, like me, you're of a certain vintage, you'll recall when early Sunday evenings on BBC One were home to a rolling smorgasbord of family-friendly smash drama series. Well, we have our own take on that genteel age of broadcasting with Gary Duncan, shivering in Lavenham cold climate, with his much-admired follow-up pun, The Wyndham the Willows. Well, all I can say, Gary, is a poop poop. Also a fan of refined early evening in from top telly is Saul Humphrey, whose fondness for the works of James Herriot sees him startling cows in the fields around Wroxham and North Walsham in All Creatures Great and Smallborough, before throwing himself into the mere to emerge Mr. Darcy style in Pride and Prejudice. A favourite of Mrs. Humphreys, we're told, though it will startle the ducks. Richard Ross of Beyond Wealth Management also offers fantasy series The Witches of East Winch. OK, he says, I know it's a film. Ah, Richard, it's also been a TV show, several times in fact, so you're in the clear.
All irregularities will be handled by the forces controlling each dimension. Marsh halophytes are available. Golden, Picklewort, Plantain, Samphire and Steel. Samphire and Steel have been assigned.
Thank you to James Lee Burgess for prompting me to do exhaustive research into both Samphire and Sapphire and Steel for that bit. Was it worth it? No. No. James Ricks is running pell-mell from the shambling, burbling, brain-eating hordes of Long Stratton in The Whacked and Dead! He needs to turn to Norfolk Screen's Craig Higgins, who is hoping to take the mustard throne and manning the seawall defending the county from Lincolnshire, I expect, in Game of Thornham. And David Parfrey knows how to appeal to my inner nerd with my and surely everyone's favourite time traveller, landing at a site in Suffolk, mingling with ancient Anglo-Saxons in Doctor Who. So, how to declare a winner? I'm going to split the honours. The Matryoshka Award for an homage within an homage goes to Christopher Raymer. The Support Your Local Pun Fighter Award for the sheer breadth, depth and velocity of entries, Gary Duncan. The Norfolk-Suffolk Perfect Pairing Award goes to Penny Hundleby for expertly assembling Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Congratulations all. That's all for this week. I've been Mike Rigby, and thank you once again to Clare Precey, Mike Talbot
and David Powles. Thank you to those brilliant students on the broadcast journalism course at the University of East Anglia. We wish them every success for the future. To everyone who participated in Challenge Anglia's Telly Time, which now seems about 1 billion years ago. To Engineer 49, who's currently on his annual pilgrimage to replace all the valves at Jodrell Bank. And to you for listening. You could be doing anything with your time, and you're listening to me blather on about the East of England, which is wonderful to know. Thank you so much. I'll be back next week, so until then, bye for now. Eastern Promise is a Priors Croft production for the Eastern Promise East Anglia Community Interest Company.